Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Cup Reviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I will be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and I am joined today by a very lovely panel of returning faces to discuss the 2016 production of Yerma, the adaptation by Simon Stone, after the play by Federico Garcia Lorca, as it played theatrically at the Young Vic and is now available for viewing on the streaming service National Theatre at Home. We're so excited to talk about this piece with all of these very exciting people, specifically in the lead up to a production that is happening right here in Toronto at the Coal Mine Theatre that is about to start, and we'll have a review of that coming out as well. But before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our amazing panelists. We have, I guess we'll just start going clockwise on my Zoom screen. We're going to start with Carly Billings. So good to have you back.
Thanks for having me. I'm great. So excited to be here.
Yes, we're excited to have you. What was the last episode you were on? Do you remember?
Oh, gee, it's been a while. I know the last one we together were on. Yes. That was Brokeback Mountain, which was a whole moment.
Yes. Oh, if I could get that piece out of my head, I would, but I can't.
It stays in there. It stays in there.
And what do you have in your cup today?
I'm being very good and being very hydrated with some classic H2O.
Love it.
Nothing fancy, but a staple.
Yep, it doesn't need to be fancy. It's great. Okay, and moving continuous, at least clockwise on my screen, we have Jimmy Zhao. So good to have you back.
Hi, glad to be here. Yeah.
Yes.
It's been a while.
Yeah, I think Frankenstein was the last or possibly only episode you've been on to date.
Yep.
But we're happy to have you back for another one. And what do you have in your cup today?
Also water. Well, not anymore because I drank it, but yeah.
Do you want us to pause while you go fill it? Or you're good?
No, that's okay.
Okay, you are sufficiently hydrated.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. And last but not least, we have a very frequent flyer here on the cup is Alicia Plummer. So good to have you back.
Good to be here, Ryan. It's been a while. I think the last show that we reviewed was Showboat, or
wow, has it been that long? Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
You were on the Showboat episode, so good to have you back after all of that business. And what's in your cup today?
Today, I have chocolate mint tea. And I don't really drink it that often, but I felt like it was a special occasion back on the Cup Reviews. Yes. So I'm going to have some nice tea.
Love it. That's great. And to round out this circle, I am also on the H2O train as I'm drinking water. But all of my special Cup of Hemlock cups are currently in need of cleaning, so I will be drinking it out of Donatello's head. So that is silly. I apologize. It's not
perfect.
It's perfect. I feel so supported right now. Thank you. So we're going to dive into this National Theatre production with our usual first question, which is, what do you think of the cast? And which character did you think was best performed? Alicia, I'll start with you for this one.
Sure. The cast overall, honestly, the cast was phenomenal. I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't do any research. I was like, time to just watch some theater. And my favorite performance or performer was Billie Piper, who played her in this production. I'm not saying my expectations were low. I am just saying that I was just watching a show and I didn't really do any research, but I was so in it with her. Billie did a phenomenal job with her characterization. There are some heavy vocal moments in this piece as well. There's a lot of voice work that I'm sure went into this production. So I was just glued to my screen watching this and watching her. And there were moments when I felt like I was living her story as well. Like, that's how good it was. Also, I really liked John, which was played by Brendan Cowell, who also was phenomenal and did amazing work. And I felt like he was really grounded, and I wanted to hate his character, but I ended up really just enjoying his performance and enjoying what he brought as an actor as well. So overall, those two are my favorite performers in the show, which would be Billie and Brendan.
Great. Coming out strong by picking our two leads who carry so much of this production. I don't think there's a single scene where at least one of the two of them isn't on stage. Billie Piper carries so much of the show. She's in almost every scene, but the few that she's not, I'm pretty sure Brendan Cowell is in as well. So you've got the whole show pretty well covered in your choices. Jimmy, you want to pick up here? Who is your cast shout out?
Oh, yeah. I think we can all agree that, regardless of acting ability, the best member of the cast was whoever played the baby, because that was the most
it was a real
adorable
baby.
Yeah.
It wasn't an American Sniper doll baby.
Exactly, yeah. So I really enjoyed their performance, and I hope to see that baby in future National Theatre live shows. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to contribute that. I'm not going to, because, there's a small cast, so I'm just going to, I'm not going to.
Yeah, you don't want to get greedy and shout out too many adult humans.
Exactly, yeah.
One baby sufficient. Oddly enough, the baby is not listed in the program. So
I thought it's a very, that baby needs a shout out. You know?
It's well deserved. Clearly, the baby has no ego, doesn't need to get top billing, but it's great. Speaking of billings, Carly, how about you? What was your cast shout out?
I'm all for more baby representation. The second the baby showed up, I said, that's a real baby, which was surprising and delightful. But I'm going to double down on Billie Piper. I mean, you just got to give it to her. I'm coming into this a Billie Piper fan. I've seen her work on like Doctor Who. But like, she just blew me out of the water, blew me absolutely away. The depth, everything that she brought to it. I was like, oh my goodness. So Billie Piper all the way.
Yeah. That's great. Yes, she definitely is the top billed star in this piece, and I think she carries it very well. I guess for my own cast shout-outs, pick two that haven't been addressed yet. I was quite fond of John McMillan, who played Victor. He was just a fun, kind of funny presence from the very beginning. In his first scene, he does this one awkward laugh that just sold me from the start. And I was just very invested in his journey through this piece. He isn't in it a lot. He comes in and out periodically, but he just was so charming and likable, and you could simultaneously understand why her, not Yerma, her, has these strong lingering feelings for him, but also feel the pathos about his feelings about the way this relationship ended. So big shout out to him. And also quite liked Maureen Beatty, who played Helen, the mother character. I thought she was just another whimsical presence. Her accent was on point. I don't believe I've seen this performer before, but I would imagine that's how she actually speaks. But yeah, she did such a great job. And that character, to my recollection, doesn't exist in the source material that this play is based on, which we'll talk a lot more about as we go on. But she brought a very interesting grounding presence to every scene she was in while still being very whimsical. So those are my two shout-outs. Okay, moving on from the actors on stage to the rest of the production. What was everyone's favorite production or design element? Carly, you went last time, so kick us off here.
Yeah, I mean, the set. It was in a glass box, a glass house, bubble of emotion. Can't ignore it. It's the thing that's the elephant in the room. That whole thing was just incredible. And particularly my favorite part, glass aside, was the changing of the floor. I thought that was so incredibly moving. And I was like, National Theatre, you did it again.
Yes, they're making very good use of the big budget they have.
Yeah.
And very good use of long, dark scene transitions where they are very clearly rushing to change the floor, but it happens, at least from our pre-recorded viewing, in a very seamless fashion. So well done there. I will jump off on what you're saying because the set was also my choice for the shout-out production element. Again, it's just the glass has this image of not throwing stones, so to speak. And I don't know if I have much more to add to what you said, but I thought it was really well done. The characters felt always boxed in and very much constantly being scrutinized under this magnifying glass that puts their life under a microscope. I've used a lot of glass imagery here, but I think the production certainly calls for it. Alicia, what was your favorite production or design element?
I also put the set, but I put some other notes as well.
Go for it.
The music transitions were so lovely. They were lovely at first, and then the music kind of got super intense along with the story. So I was like, I'm a little scared now. But overall, I think the music that went throughout the play and filling in for the transitions, I was almost expecting it each time, and it was there. So I was comforted every time I heard. It was like, it's almost sounded like angels singing at first. And then it got a little scary and intense. So I think I was just excited to hear what the transition music was going to be. And I believe the music was done by Stephen Gregory. So they did a great job with that. That was my favorite element.
Great, thanks. And Jimmy, finish us off.
Yeah, I also, of course, really noticed the set, how it like sort of changed depending on the mood, how like, in the middle it was like, there was like grass and green, but towards the end it was more like, gray and Anyways, but yeah, but since it hasn't been said yet, I guess I'll also shout out the costumes. I think the costumes were done really well. I'm not good at talking about clothes, but it felt like the one missing piece that should be mentioned. So if anyone has anything to say, yeah.
Anyone want to jump on that prompt? Alicia, go for it.
Yes, I would love to jump on that. I agree, Jimmy. I think the costumes were done, it was modernized, which I think we're going to talk a bit more about later. But I was really intrigued by the costumes for some reason. They were pretty simple, pretty like dull colors. So I wasn't really focused too much on what the characters were wearing. I was mostly focused on what they were saying. And I think at one point I wondered, like, oh, the main character, she's been wearing that same outfit for like 4 scenes. So it just made me think about her journey as she continued throughout the play, what she was wearing by the end of the play, and how it was pretty much such a mess, like her mental state as well. So I think the costumes, though they were subtle, they still had something to bring to the play overall.
Yeah, I would even add to that yes, she's wearing the same outfit from 4 scenes, but years have passed over the course of those 4 scenes, which is an interesting thing. Mm-hmm. Usually costumes are often used in productions to mark the passage of time, that, that's how you know this scene is set in a different day, week, month, year. But we have these very big visuals telling us how much time has passed, and yet we still have the costumes persisting, which I think is an interesting way of showing how very little has changed in these characters' lives, even when a lot of time is passing. And then when we get changes later on, that certainly shows how maybe things have progressed or maybe not, and we can read into that as much as we like. Any last thoughts about production elements before we move on to something a little more sinister? No? All right. Well, not every production is perfect. We know this. Few productions are perfect, but there will always be something that maybe just doesn't hit the mark for you. So I guess we'll start with you, Jimmy. What do you think was the weakest aspect of this production?
So this really isn't like, I wouldn't say this is like a flaw so much as it is really like a feature of the style of theater. But so I watched this play. Okay, so here's my story with the play. So Please. Like in 2018, I think they broadcasted in like the movie theaters. So I was supposed to see it for a school project. So I went to see it in a theater, saw it to like the halfway point, and then blackout happened. So I couldn't see the end.
Oh no.
And it was funny because like my prof was literally in the same theater, like, where's the rest of the movie? Like complaining to and she didn't know I was there. So I was like, oh, wow, that's awkward. Anyways, but so the reason I bring that up is when I saw it in a movie theater, there weren't subtitles. And as a result, I don't feel like I really understood quite what was happening, just because of the way they spoke, how they all their dialogue built on top of each other, which obviously, is a very like, it's a very naturalistic play. That's the sort of thing that sort of unstructured style that I'm assuming they were going for. But I just think that if I were to see this in an actual theater live in any other format than seeing it streamed with subtitles where I can, go back and forth, I might not be able to grasp what was actually occurring, because after I saw the half of it, I didn't really understand what the direction the play was going, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that could just be me not being the brightest, but
I don't think that's the issue.
Yeah, but that's just sort of like the one sort of thing that I could say that could be seen as a weakness, even though I'm sure it's intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Intentional things can still be weaknesses, or things that just didn't work for you. And yeah, I would agree that there is this eclectic speech pattern that definitely leans into the heightened realism, we could call it, of these characters. Mm-hmm. But if you aren't deep in, I guess, the particular British suburbs that these characters seem to be inhabiting, we might struggle to follow all the speech patterns exactly. I do have to ask, before we move on, Jimmy, how did you do on that assignment, having only watched half of the play?
No, because like that was the last day they were playing the thing, so I couldn't do it on that play. So then my prof was like, okay, there's this other play called The Humans that's being shown, just go watch that instead. So I saw that and I did my assignment with that, and I pretty sure got like a 90 something, because
huzzah.
I like writing and talking about theater, of course.
Clearly your intelligence was not the issue with the previous one. Okay, thanks for sharing. What do you think was the weakest element of this production?
Yeah, I'd say that like hypernaturalism was a little difficult. I also I want to chalk that up to the directing, maybe. I don't know. It was really clean in a lot of aspects, but in a lot of ways it was also just kind of like, okay. It was, I don't know. It was giving me very what I expect from the National Theatre at this point, which isn't a bad thing. It's good, but is it incredibly exciting? Not from that like production aspect. I think everything else was pretty exciting.
Oh, great. That's fair. And Alicia?
For me, I think at the very beginning of the play, when John and her are having a conversation, it feels very cinematic, and it also feels like I felt like I was watching a movie, and I felt like I didn't feel like theater for a moment, which is okay, but I think it kind of lost me at times because it just felt like such an intimate conversation they were having, couldn't really keep up with what they were saying. And I was already having my assumptions about the rest of the play. I was already thinking, well, I guess this is going to be the rest of the play now. They're intimate conversations. And I assume the director did that on purpose to build up to what the play is. But I was very, very much lost for the first 3 minutes and uninterested. I do wish that the staging was a bit different just for the opening, maybe more movement, more use of space that would have kept my attention. And of course, they're British. So there was that I had to really, really focus on what was happening. So that was just me trying to understand what was going on for the first couple minutes. And then there's the ending. I don't know if we do spoilers on here. We're talking about...
We haven't done a blanket spoiler. We do have a question about the ending coming up, so if you maybe want to save your thoughts until then, unless there's something specific you'd like to address right now.
I'll save my thoughts. I think
we'll
can
make sure
share it more later.
We'll make sure to put up some kind of spoiler notice before we get to that final question. Okay, thanks. Yeah, Alicia, I think a lot of this in medias res opening and this jarring effect that we maybe get to that feeds a bit into the thing that I identified as, I don't know if I'd call it the weakest aspect, but certainly a thing that maybe rubbed me personally the wrong way. And that was just the very jarring way that we had our scene beginning and ends, specifically the ends even more so, that we were almost not even mid-sentence, mid-word sometimes on a character when blackout, big musical cue, and we're moving on to the next thing, and then we find out it's 4 years later or whatever. I kind of don't want to fault it because it is very clearly part of the effect that this production is going for, and it's certainly a choice. I just don't know if it really worked for me. I felt too much tonal whiplash and just in general whiplash at every time you're trying to follow a conversation and then it's over and suddenly we're years later. And that next scene starts very abruptly and you can't really orient yourself. And it maybe part of the reason for this effect is to disorient you. And if so, I'd say it did a good job, but it did take quite a few scenes before I could really start connecting with the characters. And I think this was a big part of why. So that just a minor thing that I would certainly address as my answer for this question. So we've kind of been shooting through all of these questions that ultimately accumulate in, would you recommend this production to others? Alicia, why don't you start us off on this one?
Of course. Yes, I would. I was on the edge of my seat. By maybe 20 minutes in, I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And this play, it deals with infertility. It deals with folks who deal with that. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, but essentially these issues are still happening today. It's not a issue that has gone away. So I think just knowing her struggle with trying to conceive and also knowing her issues with John before that, it just felt so relatable. I felt like this was a friend, and I think that's why I was so into the play. And this is a play that I would bring my mom to. I feel like anyone could enjoy this. My sister, my mom, my brother. I think this play does a great job of having a voice for every side to the story, if that makes sense. You get to see her family, workplace, work environment, the ex that makes an appearance, Victor. So I think this play has a lot for everyone. There's a baby, a live baby. I almost cried.
If you love seeing babies, this is the show for you.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Carly, what would you recommend this production to others?
I would recommend this production to others. I also thought it was just stellar. I was kind of bowled over with emotion, with timing, with just, it was like kind of the most of everything that I could have hoped for. And it deals with a lot of very human, very natural like topics and themes and issues in this really unnatural environment, which I really enjoyed. Thought that pairing was very captivating. And I think, yeah, there kind of is a little bit of something for everyone, but I also think it is in a way nice to know what you're getting into. So I personally wouldn't bring my mom to see this because my mom would be like, "What is happening? What is going on? That's terrible," Or she would just be like, "I couldn't understand them. They were just talking so fast over each other," which is for some people, but maybe not for others. But I would definitely recommend it. Just depends on the person.
Right. That makes sense. Jimmy.
Yeah, like I would recommend it to some people I know, definitely not everyone. I think it does deal with some themes that are, could be very sensitive to, like certain people that I know. And I think that it definitely does deal with like a lot of universal questions that I think everyone does sort of have like an opinion on. And I think that, like, I forget who it was that said it, but it does really show, like, I think Alicia, it does show like all sides of the issue, which I think does allow for most people to enter into it, I guess I would say. Yeah.
But you would recommend they watch it on a streaming service with subtitles.
Yes.
As we've discussed.
Or watch it in Toronto at the Coal Mine Theatre.
Yes, which go check that production out. If you like this production and you like everything we've said about this one so far, it is also going to be of Simon Stone's adaptation that is being done at the Coal Mine. So
it does make me think, because there are so many like very heavy London references. Like, I don't know. I'll have to see the Toronto production, but
that was a thought that occurred to me too. Are they going to Canadianize it? They have a lot of eminent Canadian actors involved in this production, or are they gonna all put on their thick London accents and approach it very true to the source, which is already a very loose adaptation of its original source? To just round off this question, I would agree that I too would recommend this to others. Heavy content warnings might be in order, depending on who you're recommending it to. But I would also, even though there is a lot of difficulties with the language and the alienating effects of these transitions, I would encourage people to try to stick it out. Short of a power failure that prevents you from seeing the ending, I really do think it's worth sitting through the confusion and disorientation to get to what I think is a very impactful payoff at the very end. And I really did feel for all these characters, even ones like John, who I expected not to like going in. Everybody was so well performed. It was just maybe not a fun time, but an interesting time to spend all of this time with these people. So I would highly encourage people to check this out if you're subscribed to National Theatre at Home, if you have an opportunity to see this recording, and if you're in Toronto, check out the Coal Mine production, which at time of recording none of us have seen yet, but we're all looking forward to. That's great. So we're going to move on now into our less production-focused questions and more into the dramaturgy-based questions about the play itself. And I guess we should put up some kind of blanket spoiler warning now that we are moving into the nitty-gritty of the text. We might want to tell people that if you haven't yet watched the production but think it sounds interesting based on everything we've said, consider this remainder of the episode after you've already encountered it, because we are very likely to most certainly spoil a lot of big things. And in the spirit of what we have just discussed, we should probably also put up some content warnings, because we will likely delve into discussions of suicide, abortion, and many other sensitive sexual and gendered issues that we encourage people to consider their mental health and not watch the production or continue watching our discussion if they feel that they may be triggered by any of these issues. So putting out the spoiler warning and the content warning right there. With all of that out of the way, a lot of these questions that we're going to be getting into in the sections deal specifically with the adaptation itself and its relationship between Simon Stone's rewriting after Lorca and Lorca's original piece. I shared the PDF of the original piece. I don't know if any of you have a chance to read it over, or have you read it prior to watching this piece? No worries if you hadn't. All of these questions are answerable if you didn't get a chance. But we will, in addition to spoiling this production, be spoiling the original in order to set up the comparison that's being made here. So to start us off with this first question, Simon Stone's adaptation of Lorca's original play takes many liberties with the text. One of the most significant of these changes is its transposition from 1930s rural Spain to present-day suburban UK. How do you feel that the piece fits within this modern setting? Jimmy, would you like to get us started on this one?
Sure. So I didn't read the
That's
original
fair.
play.
It was not homework. I was not trying to
Yes.
give you all an assigned reading for this.
And I can't necessarily speak to the differences between rural Spain and suburban UK, but I think that one of the strengths of like the whole like Yerma as a story, regardless of the production, is it does deal with something that like is probably like the most universal thing that any creature can experience, which is like, you know, reproduction, creating more of yourself, creating like a legacy for yourself, which, you know, can be in many forms, but the more traditionally it's always like biologically and like having children. But what I think is interesting is that I think that the play comments on how the sort of how hers sort of desire to have children is sort of it doesn't really fit within like our current modern beliefs. I feel like we do kind of see, especially like with the way that like our view of like women have like evolved, and you know, I'm a man, I'm gonna like,
We'll let the women
yeah,
in the room
okay,
answer very shortly if
yes,
you want
yes.
to.
I don't want to mansplain anything, but I do feel like that, and the play even comments on it, how I think at some point John, I think he kind of like shames her for like, you know, her desire to have children as sort of being like antithetical to the sort of modern woman who's like the stereotypical like, you know, girl boss, you know, doesn't want, focuses on her career, and then in the end, you know, she loses her job and all that stuff. She like kind of becomes like the opposite of what we currently see a, you know, image of an independent modern woman is in today's culture. But I also think that the play is smart to like not to say that, you know, oh, all women naturally want this or whatever, naturally want children or anything like that, because we do see, you know, with her friend character whose name I forget,
It was Mary. No, Mary was the sister. Des was the friend. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that it does show like a variety of, you know, a variety of women being, you know, they're women in their own ways, and it isn't saying that, oh, you know, you have to be a certain way, or you're going to, you know, you're not good, you're betraying the cause or whatever. And I think that the play does play with the idea of, does it actually fit into a modern setting, or does it not, or is this just this antiquated thing that is like Billie Piper's character just sort of like an outlier, or like runs counter to what we currently perceive women as. Yeah, so that's sort of my take on the question.
Yeah, it's great. Carly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it fits incredibly well in this modern setting. I think it does a little bit of what Jimmy says. It kind of like subverts what people expect a modern piece about women to say, which is like, women are badass. They can do anything. They don't need a man or children or all these, you know, stereotypical patriarchal things that have been historically asked of women. But I also think that it does this really brave and interesting thing of like highlighting a story of a woman in modern day who does want maybe the traditional role of mother in her life. I know a lot of people in my life who would fit this role, and I don't see their stories being told nearly as often in a modern way as, you know, the opposite. And yeah, I think it's really interesting. And also in all of the wardrobe, in all of the like modern references, it's giving absolutely 2016. So it's in content also giving, you know, fitting in modern aesthetically. And yeah, I'd say yeah.
It's great. Alicia.
I agree. I think that the way Simon made the play more modern, I think it works. I think it still works in 2023. And I just trying to think of saying something that hasn't been said already. But overall, these issues they're just issues that people have as humans that are not so far away and far removed that we have to look back to the original play for the 1930s, which I read, and it was interesting to compare the two. And in both, you can see the struggle of her, Yerma. In both, you can see. I was fascinated that in the 1930s one by Lorca, that some of the women in the play said not all women are meant to have kids. Like, it's not meant to be at times. And Yerma still was like, this is what I want. So I thought that was interesting because I was thinking, oh, it was the 1930s. I thought that's the stereotype of women having kids, yada, yada, yada. So it was interesting to see that some of these nuances from the updated version were still also subtly, or not so subtly, in the 1930s edition as well. So it's just interesting to see themes and lessons that are still carried on. And these characters in the production that we all watched, just so relatable and very tough subjects. So I'm happy that you put out that content warning for folks. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. It can definitely be done in a modern setting. I think it works.
Yeah, I would agree with everything all of you are saying. It was very interesting for me because I had watched the production before reading the original. In fact, I watched the production knowing that it was this adaptation of a work from the 1930s that I've actually had on my bookshelf for years now and had never gotten around to reading. I got it in a big haul at like a university used book sale one day, and it just fell to the bottom of the pile, and I never got around to reading The Three Tragedies by Lorca. And then I watched this National Theatre production, and I was shocked by what it was, because it really wasn't what I was expecting this play from the 1930s to be, even a contemporary adaptation of it. So that evening, I was like, I have to now read the original. I need to know what, because there's so many things in this that, like, abortion, for example, is very different in the 1930s in a rural setting versus what it means today. So I was really wondering, like, how is this grappled with? Like, what are the plot points that are being tweaked into the version we saw? And it's funny, the abortion element isn't present in the original, but I think Simon Stone did a very good job of isolating how do we conceptualize motherhood and bodily autonomy and feminism in this new light, and what elements need to be touched on even if they aren't addressed in the original. And so I was quite shocked sitting down to read the original in the same evening that I watched this, and having that immediate comparison being made in my head. And what I think in terms of this change of the time period, I think this goes down to a very important word in the marketing of this, and that's not by Lorca adapted by Simon Stone, it's by Simon Stone after Lorca. And it's a little too postmodern by half word after that we often see. I just dramaturged a production of Three Sisters at Hart House that was not by Chekhov, but after Chekhov. And it is a way that a lot of adapters are conceptualizing the way that we relate to these old pieces, and not holding ourselves beholden to, we're going to do the original, but with a bit of a rewrite to make it fit in a modern setting. It is, we are completely reattacking these pieces with a modern sensibility in mind as the foundation. And the last thought I kind of had about this is, part of me wonders what would have happened if Lorca's name was nowhere to be found in the marketing of this. Because the play is so radically rewritten, could Simon Stone have just said, this is a play called Her? Maybe not, because that would sound too similar to the Joaquin Phoenix, Scarlett Johansson cell phone movie. But if he didn't call it Yerma, and he doesn't call the character Yerma, which I find interesting, but if he called it something else, would people even notice that this is an adaptation of Yerma? So much has changed that I feel like people might think, oh, hey, it's kind of similar to that other play if they're familiar with it. But I think it's a radical enough departure that I'm not confident that people would feel like he plagiarized this other piece. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that proposition, if anyone would like to jump in.
Yeah, actually, Ryan, that's an interesting thing to bring up, because while watching the play, it made me think of A Doll's House, which is not exactly the same, but similar to a woman making her own decisions, leaving her family. Slightly different, but it also made me think of the Greek play, I believe it's called Medea, where she murders her kids. So it's like just making an extreme choice as a woman. I think it just made me think of those powerful pieces. And both plays that I just mentioned are also dated. Medea's Greek, way back, and A Doll's House, I can't remember, but it's also like 1900s, late 1800s, something like that. So I think this is a story that Simon Stone probably could have just claimed as his own, and maybe nobody would really know, which is it's a little interesting to really think about that. So it was an interesting point that you brought up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would like to say that I think that in naming it Yerma and really positioning it like as like an adaptation or like a that's stemming from the Lorca play, I think that does give it more attention. And I think like I don't think as many people would have seen it or talk about it or assigned it to be watched in a university class if it was like its original thing or marketed as its original thing. Like and I think a good example of this is that like how many of the play questions are about comparing this play to the original Lorca play. But I also think that I do think it would lose a little something if it was kind of its own thing, because I think it does make you think about the universality, how like of it, the themes that it discusses that sort of transcends like setting and time, I would say.
Yeah, even for people who aren't familiar with the older play that this is based on, knowing that one exists hints at this longevity of the themes in an interesting way. And to your point, Jivy, interestingly about, yes, I wrote up these discussion prompt questions, and I, having watched this production and then instantly feeling the need to read the original and then being fixated on the ways that it changed, yeah, it's hard to escape drawing comparisons when it is hinted in this way. And surely if he had named the play differently and not attributed it to Lorca in any way, we would be asking and talking about very different questions right now, prompting very different discussions. And so part of me thinks that implies value in this comparison, even if Lorca himself isn't this big brand with a lot of cachet like an Ibsen or a Chekhov. The thing that has a lot of brand cachet is an old play that you maybe have heard of, and that I think really does draw in audiences more so than a new original work by this playwright that you've maybe never heard of. So yeah, interesting point. Harley,
also, just sorry. Oh, sorry.
No,
just one last thing. Since we were like sort of naming things that it reminded of us, I did think that if we are looking for one that's not a play that like sort of deals with the same themes but isn't necessarily like connected to a previous play, there is a play called Lungs. Mm-hmm. I don't know if So it's sort of, I just wanted to give Lungs a shout out because I really enjoyed that like when I saw it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Carly, did you have any last thoughts on this topic before we move on?
Yeah, just one quick thing. I totally agree with everything that everyone said, but I think, tacking the original on as an exciting thing lends a lot of curiosity. I think curiosity sells, and it's very clever.
Yeah, I agree. Very clever. Good job, Simon Stone. You clever man, you. Okay, we'll move on to this next question, which is again rooted in a comparison between the source material. Described his play in this little subtitle that he attaches to it as, quote, a tragic poem in 3 acts and 6 scenes, end quote. Do you feel that Simon Stone's rewrite and direction of the piece, because he was also the director, preserves this poetic element? Carly, why don't you start us off?
I think it does and it doesn't, but I think when it doesn't, it disrupts it in a really exciting way. A way that's maybe more accessible for a modern audience. I think maybe the way that he does preserve a kind of poetic language is in the speech pattern, is in the way that they talk, which is also one of the more challenging aspects of the production, but it is also one of the most interesting. Yeah.
Great. Jimmy, you want to jump onto this?
Yeah. What I thought was interesting, now that I'm thinking about this, I didn't really think about this question that much before, but now that we're talking about this, I think what's interesting is that it sort of has this aesthetic as if it were like super structured with like chapters and stuff and like chapter headings and all that stuff. But then each individual scene is very like fast, very loose, very naturalistic. And I don't know what to say about that, but that is like an interesting juxtaposition, sort of a contrast, I guess, while I was watching it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Alicia?
In terms of what initially said about the play that he wrote, I didn't necessarily see this play as a poetic piece in six scenes, because it wasn't 6 scenes. So I was like, no, it was longer than that.
It was, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it is 6 scenes, but it's also, it's 3 acts with 2 scenes apiece, which is just such a strange way of describing it. Like, just call it 3 acts or 6 scenes, but why 3 acts and 6? Baffled my brain. That's why I wrote a question about it. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, I think it also baffled my brain too. Just the way it was worded made me think, I don't think so. I don't think this is exactly what you're saying. But tragic, yes, it definitely was a tragedy. And the way the play is set up, it was like I knew something horrible was going to happen. By the way, like no research, did not do any research, just sat down, turned my laptop on and pressed play. And the second her mentioned, I want to have children, I was like, this is not going to end well. I'm getting a vibe. They're in a glass box. I'm getting a vibe. I don't know. I think I might be slightly going off. Oh no, I'm still technically on point here about the tragedy of it all. It was poetic. I agree with what Carly said. The wording, the way the script is written, the way the actors presented themselves within the characters was very poetic, as well as the musical transitions felt very poetic to the piece. So I think that holds up to what Lorca initially intended.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that's been said so far. This idea, it's just a very strange subtitle. Again, that's why I gravitated towards it. The being prefaced at the beginning that we are dealing with a tragedy does create this sense of dread that, oh, something bad is going to happen here. And it's funny, we shouted out the baby already, but the real bait and switch moment of thinking, a year has passed, they're holding a baby, I guess it all turned out okay, only to find out in the next scene, again, tonal whiplash that, this isn't her baby, and she's still very sad, but she hasn't been able to. Yeah, it really does pull the rug, at least in this adaptation. But yeah, the tragic poem, I think, is interesting, because Lorca he was a playwright, certainly, but I think a poet first, playwright second. And this was, in the 1930s, was an interesting time when a lot of, there's been a lot of prose drama for a while, and then a lot of poets were trying to reclaim poetry for drama, writing plays in verse after prose realism had been a big trend for a long time. T.S. Eliot, Christopher Fry, et cetera, were big forces in this. And I would say Lorca is probably part of it too. And I guess the part that really feels poetic to me does come down to these speech patterns. And while having not read the play in the original Spanish, because my Spanish is just a wee bit rusty, but reading it in English translation, I feel like we might lose an element of that poeticism that was probably very inherent in the original. If I would just speculate, and if there's any Spanish literature scholars want to get in the comments and correct me about this, please do, but I would imagine that he wrote this play partly to say that poetry isn't just something exercised by the very educated, very literate people, that even the working class farmers in rural Spain at this time, there's a poetry to them in the way they speak. They represent the real folk, the people, and we should be thinking poetically about them even more so than the elite, so to speak. And I think this adaptation really preserves that well in keeping the idiosyncratic speech patterns of this not quite working class, but at least this very specific cultural type of folk, the community of this London suburb that we seem to be set in, and saying that the way they speak is just as poetic as the way a poet might speak, even if it does feel like the realism that is being infused in this dialogue might not always gel with this in the best ways. But is it a poem? Maybe, but it's definitely poetic. I don't know. Okay, so we weren't kidding about the spoiler, because this last question does deal with the ending of the play. Okay, here we go. Lorca's original version ends with Yerma killing her husband. Why do you think Stone chose to end his adaptation with her killing herself instead? What does this change do to affect your experience of the play's resolution? Alicia, why don't you start us off with this one?
Sure. I'm taking a look at my notes, and I wrote so much on this because I was flustered by the ending. So I think Stone decided to have her kill herself instead, because by the end of the play, honestly, she didn't really have much going for her. Her husband was leaving. Didn't know when he was coming back. I think he was leaving her for good. The house, I think he sold the house. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there were boxes, so I assume the house was no longer in her possession anymore. And she also was mentally not there. So I think Stone decided, for a grand ending, to just end her life along with the play. Did I love that decision? No, I was so angry, because compared to the plays that I already mentioned of Medea killing her kids by the end of it, and Nora in a doll's house leaving her family because she decided that's what she needed to do, I just felt like those were really like, controversial, but oddly heroic decisions. And I thought that's where the play was going. So to have her kill herself, and also it was so, I just didn't like the way it was done. It was so easy. I was mad. I was angry at this point. But I think Stone decided to end it like that because there wasn't much going for her by the end of the play, unfortunately. Like, I was hoping she would turn her life around. And I think Lorca with Yerma, John, sorry, his name's not John
it's Juan, which is
Juan.
very close.
Well, he straight up said, I never really wanted kids. I just wanted to be with you. And Yerma did what she had to do. Mm-hmm. But John never said.
But okay. Go on.
In an extreme case, she did what she had to do. I'm not saying she was right, but it happened. And in her choice, John never said that he didn't want kids. He said that he seemed like he really wanted to make things work, and it just wasn't working. There wasn't anything that could be saved with the relationship. So ultimately, I guess I see why Stone ended her's life by suicide. Was I okay with this decision? Absolutely not. So those are my thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if I could jump onto this, because I agree there's like a lot going on here. And it's interesting because I was equally frustrated by both endings, which I think is interesting. Part of me watching the production was like, oh my god, this is devastating. There's so many other things she could have done. I get that, the way she's suffering, she's obviously not in the best mental state, that it doesn't feel unjustified that she comes to this conclusion dramaturgically, if not personally, but is still, it's tragic. It is, I think, frustrating, or at least that's how I felt. Then I read the version in the original, and I was equally frustrated for different reasons, because part of me felt that, well, one, just, oh my god, how did Stone read this, and then what was his mental process to decide, I'm gonna completely change this? Part of me thought that maybe, I guess, to compare it to A Doll's House again, I've actually talked about this on a fairly recent episode too, but there's a pretty famous German production of A Doll's House, fairly recent, by the director Thomas Ostermeyer, and this is a production, he's a very important German director that has his version of An Enemy of the People was at Tarragon a number of years ago. He's very, Ibsen is his brand, he subverts Ibsen. And that production ended not with Nora slamming the door and leaving Torvald, but with her shooting and killing him, and his body falls into a fish tank. And the reasoning for this is, it's quite bold and I think brilliant in a lot of ways, that he recognized that, well, the divorce rate is so high here in the 21st century, we're not going to shock people by having her just leave. It's not going to shock us the way that it shocked the late 19th century German audience, or Norwegian audience, or continental European audiences, because it toured all over. So what can I do to create that sense of shock? If everybody knows how this play ends, I got to do something different. And part of me thinks that's what Stone might have been doing here, even if not everybody knows Yerma the same way that most people know A Doll's House. I think he's like, well, if you're going in expecting this ending, I will shock you by giving you something very different. The problem for me, I guess, is that even if it feels justified dramaturgically and personally, that this is the conclusion her would come to, it almost feels retrograde, like socially and politically, that, we talked a lot in the first question of this section about how, well, the way we view womanhood has changed. Feminism has progressed an awful lot since the original time of this play. That for her to feel like her life has no value because she's unable to have children, to ultimately end her life in this way, it feels like, oh, but there's so much else you could have lived for. You're a successful writer. You had a good marriage until this ultimately ruined it, etc., etc. So it seems maybe a little politically backwards, in my opinion, whereas the original ending, as frustrating as I found it, is quite bold. She takes it into her head that, you not wanting to have children is the problem, and I will seek my revenge on you. Even if it's not a position we should endorse or actions we should endorse, it is still bold and radical and doesn't necessarily place the blame on the defective female body, I think, in the way that we might view this revised ending. Sorry, I've thrown a lot out here. These are the thoughts that were buzzing in my head. Carly, you're smiling. Do you want to jump on any of this or give your answer?
I sure do. Yeah, I think the original ending was very bold, and I think this new ending for this modern audience is a little less bold. But I do think it was the only way to ensure that she would kill her child, because I know in the original, her killing her child is just killing her husband, and then now she can't have children because she has no husband. But I think for modern audiences could be like, there's lots of ways to have a kid, lady. Like, lady, you don't need a husband to have a kid. And so for her to truly kill that kid is, she has to kill herself, which is terrible. And I don't think it was nearly maybe as effective. I don't think it had the same kind of payoff. But I do think that if that is the goal of the ending, I think it achieved that goal. Is it frustrating and even more devastating to watch? Yeah. And I was like, I do not feel resolved. But I think it's kind of the only ending that made sense or was possible if the end goal was that she is to, kill her child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Jimmy.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the way I interpreted it was similar, like what Carly said, was that it was her trying to erase the uncertainty of whether or not she is ever going to have a child. And, before it was like, oh, if I don't have a husband, I can't possibly have a child. But now we're like, well, no, you could definitely just get, someone else to impregnate you or whatever. But I don't know, here's the thing. I didn't read Simon Stone's script or whatever, or so maybe I don't know what was the intention, but I thought it was ambiguous whether or not she dies. I don't know. Maybe if I read the script, it's and then she kills herself or whatever. Yeah. But no, because at the end, I think it's not so much, the importance isn't so much whether or not she survives, because it looked survivable, to be honest. You could easily survive a gut stab, like a lot of people do. But it was the fact that her uterus or, her reproductive organs are no longer functioning. Because the last thing that she does is breathe, right? Just or something, right? So I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, no, she could walk that off. Yeah. She could call an HS or whatever, and yeah. But I would like to add that I find all this talk of Yerma killing her husband, doing what she had to do, a bit disturbing, because the guy just got married last week. And also, thank you. And I don't want biological kids, so.
Yes. Well, hopefully that's a frank conversation you and your new spouse had prior to time.
Yeah, definitely. No, very.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyways, I would like to add my personal
no, that's fair.
relationship to the play.
Yes, I think that we could all agree that it's okay if you want kids, it's okay if you don't want kids. Make sure you are honest and open with your partner about that before you engage in a many-year process of trying vigorously to have children, as we see in this play. And to your point about the does she kill herself? I think perhaps I phrased this question in a way that does put too much certainty on that. It's certainly how I read it. She is alone in this moment. I don't see her gesturing towards the phone to call EMS or anybody. But yes, I think you are very astute to point out that it's more about the reproductive organs than it is her own life being extinguished here. So thank you for adding that to the discussion. Well, that is the end of the list of questions we have. Are there any last thoughts anybody would like to chime in before we sign off?
Yeah, Jimmy, what you just said about it being ambiguous of her dying or not, I actually sort of agree. It did look like she died, so that's why I was very upset at the time. But I did hear a little gasp. I saw some twitching. There was some movement there. So maybe she survives. I think it almost could be up to interpretation. But I did see it as her dying, but there was a part of me thinking I saw a breath, I saw some movement. So maybe it's not as hopeless as it seems to be at the very end. So who knows?
Or alternatively, is the release of hope the freeing thing that she's looking for this whole time? I don't know. But anyway.
Yeah. I think we need Simon Stone, if you're watching, write a sequel. Have her wake up in the hospital and be like, whew, I'm glad I survived that. Anyway, I'm free of this thing that has been weighing over my head for so long. Maybe I'll write a novel. And that could be what we follow her doing for, I'd watch it. I don't know.
She is a writer.
She is. Yeah. That seems, I'd liked her to have another prospect of something like a child that she can maybe get a little less personally invested in.
Yeah. London has a good healthcare system.
That's good. I hope she's okay. An American version of this play would probably turn out very differently. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation. This has been so fun to unpack this very interesting piece with all of you. Once again, this has been Yerma, the Young Vic production from 2016. Simon Stone after Federico Garcia Lorca. It's on National Theatre at Home for anybody who's interested in watching it. And if you're in Toronto or planning on visiting Toronto soon, check out the production at Coal Mine Theatre. It's their first production in their new venue that has been reopened after the very unfortunate fire that they had in their old venue, which was quite ironic after the last play they did being Detroit, which has a very large fire in it. I don't believe there was a connection between those two things, but feels like an omen. But yes, check out that production, check out this production. Before we go, I want to give each of you a chance to plug your socials or anywhere you want people to find you. Alicia, would you like to go first? Where can people find and follow you?
Sure. You can find me on Instagram at It Is Alicia Plummer. I repeat, It Is Alicia Plummer. That's my artist Insta. You can follow me to see what I'm up to in my artistic journey. I act, I write plays, sometimes I sing. I also make TikToks. If you want to follow me on TikTok, you can find me at Hi Alicia, by Alicia. And yeah, just stay tuned with whatever I am doing.
Great. Thank you. Carly, where can people find and follow you?
Sure. You can follow me all over the internet at Ms. Carly Billings, being MS, Carly Billings. You can also follow my theater company, Afterlife Theater. We have some exciting stuff happening this late winter, early spring. And you can keep up with us all over the internet as well at Afterlife Theater.
Great. Thank you so much. And Jimmy, sorry to interrupt your honeymoon, but where can people find and follow you?
Okay, so I'm on TikTok at JJYZ. That's JJYZHAO. I post there sometimes. And also I have a YouTube channel called I Will Say This Though, like though THO. It's sort of like this actually, like sort of like podcast style, like me and a friend talking about various topics, like ranking Batman movies by how racist they are. And yeah, and if you're a literary agent, I'm trying to get a novel published, so you can reach out to me at jimmy.zhao.writing@gmail.com.
Great. Thank you so much. And as always, you can find Cup of Hemlock at COH Theater on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, we are Cup of Hemlock Theater on YouTube. Like, share, subscribe. If you're listening to this as a podcast, do the podcast things. Thank you all so much. Once again, it's been a lovely discussion. And stay healthy, stay safe, and cheers. Take care, everyone.